Good evening and welcome to the Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host, and once again I have this privilege of joining you to hear a story. Tonight we're going to hear two stories because we have a couple joining us this evening, Tim and Jackie Oglesby. Now, I joked with them beforehand that it might be easier for me to tell you what denominations they had not been a part of because they have quite a long journey. Former Baptist, Disciples of Christ, Assemblies of God, and Charismatic. That was Tim, and Jackie is a former Methodist. But it's wonderful to have you both on the program. It's been...
Thank you, Marcus.
I'm trying to think how many years it's been now since you and I...
5 years.
We had dinner together.
5 years ago, we had a 2-hour session that in many ways changed our lives, and we are so thankful to be here.
And that was associated with the EWTN Family Celebration, right?
It was. Well, it was the family conference that the Wichita Diocese
that's what it was,
does.
yeah.
And you were a speaker, and your lovely wife was there.
That's right.
And one of your younger sons. I'm not sure which
Right.
one, but
Right. Well, it was good.
it was a great time. Well, that's part of our,
I remember
our
that.
story.
I remember that dinner that we had, and then we kind of lost track, and I wasn't sure. But
Yeah.
here you are.
Yeah.
So it's great. So let me get out of the way because we got two of you to fill in an hour.
Yeah.
I'm not sure which one of you wants to start out first.
Start first.
All right.
Well, I want to start with a story. Once upon a time, many years ago, in the course of history, a little girl was born in the heartland of America. She grew up in a community that was more like an extended family, but it was a little bitty village, and it had a little bitty Methodist church, but she thrived there. Her grandmother, when she was about 5 years old, led her to the Lord. And by the time she was 8, she was seeking the Lord herself. She was really working at that. Then it comes time when she turned into a teenager, and the time was the 60s, and that little girl was me, and I became a very rebellious in my heart type of person. I didn't rebel against mom and dad openly, or I would have been grounded a lot. But
Do they still use those words anymore?
no, I don't think
sure.
so. Grounded is a good word, but
Time out, I think, is what they use.
time out, yeah.
Right.
I had many years of growing in the church, though, and I was very well formed in the church, in the Methodist church. My teachers were all good in the church. I really was formed well. Got married when I was 21 to my Prince Charming, and he was a producer and director of in a local television station. He worked with mostly on when the live programs were on, like the news, things like that. It didn't take us long, though, to realize that city life probably wasn't for us. So we moved back to the farm where he was raised. Huh. And his mom and dad were just beautiful people. They had a little Down syndrome daughter still living at home, and she just ministered to us all her life. I should say, fallen away from the church between the time of high school and the time we moved back to the farm. So it was good when we moved to the farm because we were back in church. And the community was another community that was strong, and we were just so busy with all of that. When the charismatic movement started to move through, that is when my faith really took off and began to grow. I came to our Methodist pastor, and I asked him if he would help me acquire my prayer language, and he was so gracious. He did that. He did that for us. I was very close to two of my friends that I'd grown up with all my life, and we just were inseparable all of our growing up years, but we kind of grew apart at that time. My faith, however, would be tested. I should say in between that, moving up to the farm, we had our first child. As a little boy, we celebrated his life. It was so joyful. He carried on the family name, and it was just amazing to have a little guy running around and learning the farm life. And you become indoctrinated when you're growing up there. It's like being growing up a
very
Catholic.
Much a deep culture.
A deep culture. When you grow up Catholic, you are indoctrinated with that. Well, that's farm life. And then a few years later, we had our little girl, our little princess, and she was more like me, kind of quiet and laid back, but it was a great life. We spent 22 years, almost 23 years on the farm like that, Mom and Dad right there, raising those kids with us. It was beautiful. But my faith, like I said, was to be tested. I lost him very suddenly in an accident.
Well, a farm accident or?
No.
Oh, okay.
No, he was he was killed on the road coming back from a meeting that he was at.
Oh, wow.
And it totally turned my life upside down. I was crushed. I was panicked. I was scared. And it still moves me to this day to even talk about that. But
was your income the farm?
Income was from the farm. We were dairy farmers. Right before that time, though, we'd gotten into more of a beef herd, and we're not doing our dairy anymore. So, thank God, I didn't have the dairy to take care of all by myself. But my mother and my dad, all of our friends tried to reach out to me at that point. My family were just so close, but they were not penetrating what I was going through. I was so dark and crushed. I turned to alcohol, and it was to numb the pain at first. Yeah. And what happened instead is it became the pain. And I was deep enough in that at the time that I couldn't seem to improve. I couldn't get back out of it. All the time that my friends were trying to reach out to me, I had a friend that kept asking me to go to her church. And I just kept saying, no, I don't think so right yet. But eventually I did go to her church. I would sit in the back row, and the first time I went, the pastor there absolutely scared the daylights out of me. He was a charismatic pastor, Pastor Quentin, and I didn't know quite how to handle all of that, but the worship music was so beautiful and it ministered to me. I kept going back to that church, even though it wasn't the Methodist church in the Methodist ways, but I loved it. I would go home at night and I would listen to Christian radio, Christian television, the beautiful music, and that began to penetrate into my soul. And I began to see rays of hope shining through. I'd go to church and I'd come home and I'd go to listen to the music and the preaching, and all night long, Marcus, I did that because it helped to calm my spirit. Eventually, one night when I was laying there and I was in such deep pain and I was crying out to the Lord, and I was in agony. I was in serious agony. I was halfway asleep and the Lord just sent a bolt of love that went clear through me. And it's like all my cells inside just burst, and I couldn't believe the Lord would do that to me. I just cried and I laughed and I shouted and I prayed in tongues. And about this time, of course, my family was grown almost, and my daughter came home from work and she thought, my mom has just lost it. But I just grabbed her and hugged her, and I told her, the Lord loves you so much, and he loves me so much. And I just couldn't get over it. I just couldn't get over it. It was so beautiful. But that's how the Lord broke through. I had like a Paul knocked off your donkey experience. I'm sure that's how he felt. So I went back to church again, and of course a changed person. My experience there was I had been sitting on the back row and listening and being ministered to, and one day it's like the Lord was telling me, someday, one day, you're going to marry that guy up there. And he was Tim up on the stage. I had no idea what his life was like.
She didn't tell me either, so.
I had no idea who this person was, but I eventually learned he had lost his wife shortly after I lost my husband. He obviously had such joy going through him, and he was just, I just couldn't believe that our lives could be so different, and I was walking such a different way. But he ministered to me in his worship music. And once I'd learned that he lost his wife, I couldn't believe the Lord was actually telling me that I was going to marry him someday. He had 2 little kids. And, but I got to where I accepted that. And I invited...
Without telling me yet.
I invited him and his little kids up to our farm for dinner one night.
I'll never forget that.
And I made sure that my son was home from college, and I told him what was going through my spirit, that someday I'd probably be married to him. And I made sure our daughter was home from work and she could meet him.
It was quite an evening.
I told my mom and my dad and my grandmother that someday I was going to be married to him, and they just, I'm sure, just thought I was crazy. But the Lord actually did put that combination together. And Tim at the time still didn't know any of this. His little girl came over and sat on my lap.
Yes.
This is one of the funny things. Came over and sat on my lap, and I was reading a book to her, and she was kind of snuggled up in my lap, and Tim was just looking at this, and he said, and looking at my house, and he says, I don't think I could live here. This
There was a lot more to it than that, but that was one of the thoughts that went through my mind.
This doesn't have any air conditioning. That's what he was thinking.
Yeah, there was some practical things going on as well.
But anyway, I'm going to leave the story there because that's when our lives came together.
All right. Well, our guests are Tim and Jackie Oglesby. We've just heard Jackie's side of part of it. So you have a strong Methodist, but now charismatic, and a fully reborn charismatic life. I
had absolutely been so changed over those years.
Well, all right.
Yeah.
So the Lord was getting you ready.
And wow, my early life was, I was one of 4 kids, the second one. The second one always seems to fight for attention, and I was one of those people. But my early religious life, my early church life that I remember, the first church I remember was Southern Baptist. And the pastor, I remember his name was Pastor Stan. He was a tall redhead, and he could preach. I remember that. I was 6 or 7, somewhere in there. But I do remember when the call to come forward came from Pastor Stan, and my heart was just thumping. And but yet I knew Jesus wanted into my life even at that age. I knew that. And that stayed with me throughout my childhood. But that was the first time that I really remember that. And my dad moved around. My dad's 92 and he lives in Mississippi. Hi, Pops. It's good to see you. Or good for you to see me. But in those days, we moved around because he followed some jobs. And so the next church I remember was Disciples of Christ. And we had moved to Nebraska, a little town called Ashland, Nebraska, a little town of about 1,100. And the thing I remember about the disciples of Christ is they sang the doxology a lot. And the other was they passed this tray, and there's little glasses of grape juice and then these little white biscuits. Now, I was in that church for 6 or 7, maybe 8 years. But I don't remember anybody sharing with me why we passed that tray and what was that all about. And yet, there was a seed planted inside of me that we did that every Sunday. And that somehow would come back then later on. Yeah. So as I was growing up, at 15 years old, my voice changed. I had a big baritone voice at 15 years old. And so my dad had studied piano at KU. So he was quite a pianist. And so I began to sing for funerals and weddings and a few vocal contests. And it was a Leave It to Beaver kind of thing. I mean, it really was a beautiful childhood. I have a brother that we're less than a year old. For 3 days, we're the same age, so I really bug him for those 3 days. And 2 younger sisters, Susie and Melissa. And we had a great life. And so after I had won a couple of vocal contests and I had been in the lead in the musicals, and I thought I was a pretty big fish in probably a pretty small pond. And then graduated high school and went to the University of Nebraska and became a guppy in the ocean is what I became.
I understand.
I realized there was a whole lot of very talented people out there. And so I was 25 miles away at the University of Nebraska, and the only time I really came home, because I enjoyed our time of independence, was when I needed my laundry done, and I would bring it home to my mother. Her name was Buzzy Oglesby. Now, that's my heritage. Buzzy Oglesby got the name because she was like this all the time. And she was a wonderful, wonderful woman. When the church was open, we were always there. But I remember one particular weekend when I came home, and I had a lot of clothes that needed to be done, and I got up to the screen door. And there she was. She was in the screen door and she was crying. And I mean, it wasn't just crying, it was sobs. And I thought, oh no, something horrible has happened. And I got in the living room, sat down on the sofa with her, and I finally asked her, Mom, what's going on? And she kept saying, I knew about Jesus, but now I know him. Now I know him. And these big tears. And she started talking about this charismatic movement. Well, this was the late 60s, early 70s. And she started to share about these people that were filled with the Spirit, and they had all these gifts going, and speaking in tongues, and gifts of healing, and she was just, all of this was gushing out of her. And I was a little skeptical. In fact, I was a lot skeptical because my mother was very emotional. But I watched her. I watched her very carefully over 5 or 6 weeks. And there was a genuine change in my mother's life. It was phenomenal. And by the time that things ended, in 6 or 7 weeks' time, our whole family was transformed, filled with the Spirit as we understood it in those days. And that was the raging of the charismatic movement in the eastern Nebraska that was going on. I can remember when we gathered in Chiefs Stadium in Kansas City with 65,000 people speaking in tongues and praising God, and these beautiful songs that were lifted out of that stadium. And all these experiences. We actually had a prayer and praise group that met on Friday nights that would start like 7 or 8 o'clock and go till 2 a.m. We had 3 or 4 Catholic nuns that came to that prayer and praise because they were going through the charismatic movement as well. Sweetest souls that I think I ever met. And they just sang so beautifully in the Lord. And I thought, this is incredible. So my brother and I, we were all transformed. My brother and I, a little older, but we decided, let's go down to ORU. I think there's some stuff happening at Oral Roberts University. So we packed up the car and went down there in faith because we didn't have a whole lot of money. And we got down to ORU, And we went into the financial office to let them know we were on board now. We're down here on faith. And this gentleman looked at me and said, well, get in that line right now because they're all in faith too. And there was a long line of guys that had just showed up and said, I'm down here on faith. But God did some beautiful things. And he really did provide for us financially so we could go to school. I was only there a year, but I met my wife, Connie, who was a freshman, and I was basically a sophomore at that point. And Connie was from Kansas City, and she sang beautifully, and she was a beautiful, beautiful gal. And it didn't take long for us to know that we were meant for each other. And so we knew we were probably going to get married the next summer. So hitchhiking was a big deal back in those days, you remember? And I got up in the in the lunchroom at ORU and invited everybody to the wedding. I said, come. Well, a bunch of them showed up. We had this big wedding in Kansas City. We did it in the Nazarene church. We rented the Nazarene church. Didn't tell them about the Jesus band that was going to play before our wedding. And that changed their policy on weddings forever after. They never allowed that again. But that's how Connie Kay and I started our journey together. And those were the days where Jesus was coming any day.
Right.
And we got caught up in the whole Jesus is going to come and snatch us all away. And the rapture was the big deal.
Did you become a minister at this point?
No.
Oh, okay.
No. I'm
Okay.
still trying to figure out
All right.
stuff.
Okay. But you're not milking cows like
No.
No.
I don't know her yet.
Of course.
So Connie Kay and I started our lives, and I went back to the University of Nebraska because I wanted to teach music. And Connie went part-time as well, and we had 2 little ones. And life was very interesting. We had a very strong college group, a charismatic group on campus at the University of Nebraska, and it actually grew into a church. It actually planted a church called Christ Place in Lincoln, Nebraska, still going, big church now, but it started from this college campus charismatic group that Connie Kay and I were a part of. And in fact, I'm still very close to Connie's dad. We have breakfast, Dad Friedley, and I am so thankful for him. But as we went through this wonderful life we were having, at 33 years old, Connie Kay was diagnosed with cancer. And it was advanced. And that turned everything upside down. First of all, we thought we were leaving in 88 when Jesus was coming again, and that didn't happen. Then maybe 89, and that didn't happen.
For the audience, there were pamphlets put out, 88 reasons Jesus is coming in 88, and then didn't come. So in the next year, 89 reasons why.
And it wasn't just one denomination that was affected by that. There was a whole bunch of people that were looking to. I didn't buy life insurance for us because I was convinced, who's going to collect? I mean, it's like...
Yeah, people weren't finishing college, people weren't getting married.
They weren't.
Yeah, the whole certain rapture group of folk, right?
Yeah. By now, I've started a career in marketing with Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Kansas. And here we are, and Connie Kay is now fighting. And we fought for 5 years. And we were free of the cancer twice. It came back a 3rd time. And because we had basically become part of that camp that believed that you could stand on the Bible and your faith could get you the miracle that you needed to have. And that was a strong emphasis of all of us at that time.
I remember it being called seed faith.
It was seed faith. Oral Roberts had a lot of that, but then Kenneth Copeland's ministry began, and my dad was in the Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship. My mom was in Women's Aglow. So the day that Connie Kay was diagnosed with cancer, I got a call from my dad, and he said, Mom is not well. And she had kept some of that from us kids because she didn't want us to be concerned. But by the time we got down there, she was almost gone. And so I lost my mom not too long after we found out Connie Kay was diagnosed with cancer. So 5 years, the third time it came back, it got very, very bad. And I've got a 1 to 2 year old, I can't remember what Chrissy was, but Nick was 6 or 7. It got tough. And I can remember I felt like a failure. I mean, I felt like I didn't do something right, or I should have done something more. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Which is a part of that group. You could subtly get the idea that this is happening because I didn't have enough faith.
Exactly.
I didn't pray enough. I didn't sacrifice enough. The seed faith idea. I didn't give it enough, or whatever it was. And,
That's it.
Yeah.
And so, fortunately, while this is going on, someone gave us some cassette tapes by the name of Malcolm Smith. Have you heard of Malcolm?
Well, that whole group during that time.
Yes, exactly. But the thing that caught me was how he taught on the unconditional love of God. And if there was ever a time where I needed to hear that God loved us unconditionally, I needed it right then. And I got that. And so when I finally settled the fact that God is love, he doesn't have it, he is it, then I knew whatever was going to happen here, that Connie was going to be okay, that we were going to be okay, God would take care of us. We knew that. And so at that same time, this young pastor, she's going to the church over there now, and this was after Connie Kay and I had become part of that church, but this young pastor came into our lives in the last year of Connie's life, year and a half maybe, and he was transitioning a Pentecostal Holiness church, so there's my next denomination, but it was moving into a charismatic community church, so there's my next church experience. Beautiful couple, Quentin and Annie Moore, loved us just because we needed to be loved. They weren't trying to get something from us. They could see how desperate our situation was. They loved Connie. We ended up leading the worship in that church. Connie Kay and I led it for quite a while until Connie couldn't do it anymore. Wow. And then it got very difficult. And at 38 years old, she went home. And I'll never forget the night. She went home. I was actually laying in the bed with her, and her breaths were so shallow, and yet I felt her very last breath. And at that moment, it seemed like angels were crowded in that bedroom. And so when she talks about the joy that she saw in my life when she came into the church, part of that was I knew Connie was not hurting anymore. I knew where she was and wherever all of us want to be, so I was okay. Now, people didn't understand all that, but I'd watched her fight that for 5 years. And I knew the pain that she had gone through. And I was so glad that she was not in pain anymore. So at that point, I stepped away from leading the worship for quite a while. There was another gentleman that took my place for a while. And then eventually I stepped back in. And that's when I began to notice there was a lady in the back of my class that I taught. Malcolm Smith had written a book called Spiritual Burnout. It's a great little book. And I was teaching this class on spiritual burnout, and this lady sitting in the back. And that's when I began to inquire, because she seemed like she was by herself. And sure enough, I found out that she had just lost her husband just before Connie Kay had passed away. And then we began to talk. And then we began to talk on the phone quite a bit. And then I can take you to the restaurant, the Village Inn, to the booth that we were in. And I remember the night that we ate some pie and drank some coffee, and we cried and we laughed. And God, he was doing something, and I knew it. Now, I hadn't gone up for chicken dinner yet, but I knew something was happening, because I was in a difficult place. My kids were little, and I knew I probably would remarry at some point because they needed a mom. But this was about 1.5 years, not quite, maybe 2 years after Connie had passed. It was still difficult. And yet here's this lady that, we immediately shared our grief, and she caught something apparently that was going on inside of me that attracted her. She didn't tell me that we would be married at that point, but we did have this relationship that began. And then I do very well remember their chicken dinner, and it wasn't just chicken dinner that brought us to the point of marriage, but it was an important part because it was very good chicken, Marcus. Very good fried chicken.
Why don't we pause there and let that digest, and we'll come back in a moment and pick up with there that the Lord has brought you to. It makes me wonder whether the day you got that tape was the same day you had that experience.
I would almost guess it.
I was just wondering if that's the way the Lord was working, but we'll find out after the break. All right, we'll see you in a bit. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm your host, Marcus Grodi, and our guests are Tim and Jackie Oglesby. We've paused in the middle of a meal, right? The Lord has brought you all through that, and then brought you through that, and then there you are.
We're together.
And there you are. And at this point, you're charismatic, both of you charismatic.
We basically had
independent.
Pentecostal holiness to community church. Really not affiliated with anyone, more of an independent church. So here we're at this chicken dinner that I'm thoroughly enjoying the chicken, and after dinner, Jackie had talked about my youngest, Chrissy. She had a bunch of children's books in the corner, and Chrissy went and grabbed 2 of them, and she took Jackie by the hand and sat her down on the floor, and she sat on her lap, and I thought, wow, God is doing something here. And it wasn't long after that we both started talking very seriously about, can we put this Brady bunch together? Because it was interesting because it was 4-year increments. They were all 4 years apart. And she had the 2 oldest and I had the 2 youngest. And it was not easy to put that family together. But we were married then in the Charismatic Community Church, what is now called Abundant Life Community Church. And Pastor Quentin and Annie are our pastors. And we talked about Malcolm Smith and, talking about the unconditional love of God. Well, he also had another set of tapes on the ancient liturgy. There was we didn't realize this at the time, but there was a whole bunch of churches that were called convergent churches. And convergent churches were charismatic, they were evangelical, but they were beginning to embrace the ancient liturgy of the church, and they were getting all excited about something called the Holy Communion, which I didn't know anything about. Well, Malcolm, we fell in love with his teaching, and he is an excellent teacher. He grew up in England during the Blitz, came to the United States. He ministered in all kinds of denominations across a big swath of Christianity in a beautiful way. And so he was going to have a seminar down in Texoma, Oklahoma, on the lake down there. And it was all about what happened in the upper room. And that caught us. I mean, it was like, okay, he's been talking about this Holy Communion stuff. What is this? And he would teach the Bible in such a way that if he taught, for example, the 2 on the road to Emmaus, by the time he got done, you were on that road with the 2 and you felt and saw, and it was like you were there. That's the way he taught in a beautiful way. And I'm thinking, well, if he's doing upper room, I want in. And Miss Jackie and I went down there, and he started on Friday night, and by Sunday morning, oh my heavens. The Holy Communion changed for us in a beautiful, and I would call him a high Anglican. Yeah. So he probably had some sense of the true presence I'm not sure exactly, because Anglicans are kind of all over the board.
Right.
But I will tell you, we stayed up. We could hardly sleep on Saturday night, and then had Holy Communion the next morning. And as soon as we were done with that seminar, we fired back to Hutchinson, Kansas, which is where our base was and where our church was. And I got a hold of our young pastor that I love very dearly, and I said, we got to do this meal. He said, what are you talking about? I said, we got to do this meal. And he said, well, you're talking about communion? And I said, yes, we need to do this meal. He said, well, we do it. I said, no, we need to do it. And so we decided that maybe God was doing something with this church. By then I was kind of helping out with the leadership of the church. I don't know that I would have been called an elder at that point, but I was doing some of the worship and all that. We got to that point, and then we decided maybe God wants us to do this every week. So we started doing it every week. Well, and then we thought, well, maybe we need to move it towards the center of worship. For a charismatic community church, that was unheard of. Well, it wasn't too long before we had a gentleman that was a Christian comedian by the name of Mike Warnke.
Oh, yeah.
Mike
yeah,
Warnke.
I remember Mike, yeah.
He came to our church, and he was good friends with Quentin. And he asked us, why are you doing this Holy Communion church, or Holy Communion every time you have church? And we basically said, we're not sure, but we think God is doing something special to restore this to us. And so he said, well, you need to meet my archbishop. And first of all, I said, you have an archbishop. What is an archbishop? And he started to share about these convergent churches. That's the first time we heard that term. And there was a whole bunch of churches, and the archbishop that was the head of some of that was a gentleman by the name of Wayne Busada. And Wayne Busada, and I heard that name and my jaw dropped. I said, no, that can't be the same person, because I knew Wayne Busada at ORU. He was a Jesus freak, and he had a band, and they played at our wedding. And I'm thinking, this is crazy. Something is happening here. And sure enough, over time, we met up with Wayne, and we got very involved with the Convergent Churches movement. And eventually I became a deacon. I was ordained as a deacon. And then not too long after that, I was ordained as a priest. And then we began a ministry of being a lay pastor. We had satellite churches. We had one in Larned, Kansas. Then we had one in Newton, Kansas. And so we did that for a number of years. But what was so interesting about that convergent movement was some churches had different stresses. Some were more evangelical, some were more charismatic, some were more liturgical. Right. And I will tell you where I went. I really was drawn to Holy Communion and the liturgy of the Anglicans. And by then we were basically using Anglicans' holy orders. We were using their liturgy. We were using the Common Book of Prayer, which I love very dearly. And so they kind of let me do my thing in this little church over in Newton. And we actually had people that would visit and say, are you people Catholic? And I'd say, no, but we love the Catholics. And so that went on for a while. Well, eventually I began to see, where is this going? What's the trajectory of this? Because by now, we had started watching this program called the Journey Home program, and we are just captivated with the Baptists and the Lutherans and the atheists and the Jewish people, and all these people come into the church. We're watching it every week, and we look at each other and say, I wonder if it's going to be a Baptist this week. I wonder if it's... We were just captivated by it, and by now we're watching the Mass on EWTN. And it's fascinating us, but I'm seeing changes that are not quite what I was doing in my little church. And then I started to begin to think, oh, where is this going? Because now we're really being drawn by the Eucharist. I mean, because when Malcolm Smith taught about that meal, he talked about it as a covenant meal that was basically sealing the new covenant. And when he took us in that upper room and took us from Passover, and that's all starting to affect me. So I really began to think, well, I'm thinking we need to think seriously about Catholic. Well, we did that.
Here the Catholic Church is way over here, and here you're starting way over here.
Yeah.
You really, I'm assuming, didn't know how close you were getting to the Catholic Church.
Had no
all
idea.
along.
I'll tell you what gave us a clue early on was when John Paul II passed. When he passed, we wept in front of that TV and had no idea why. But we were crying because we knew that this was a big loss to Christianity. And so that was a clue. Well, then 2010, Michael Cumbie comes on the Journey Home program, and it's one of those Monday email nights. And
Former Assembly of God.
Former Assembly of God, but now he's also involved with Charismatic Episcopal.
Yep.
And when he said, if you'd have told me I was going to be Catholic, I'd have slapped you and your mama, I thought, this is my guy. And quite frankly, he settled a lot of things for me 3 years out. 3 years out, we looked at each other, and I began to tell the leadership that we were involved with by now. By now, Quentin is a bishop, and he's not too long from, he'd be an archbishop. And I began to tell him, I think my trajectory is different. And that was tough because they had come into our lives at a very important time. So anyway, we get to the point where I'm really kind of convinced we're going to do this, especially that night, because we looked at each other and we both said, I think we're going to be Catholic. And then we got really serious about that. And then we decided, well, I think we need to start RCIA. I was a year away from having a 30-year career finished with Blue Cross and Blue Shield, and I'm a lay pastor. I've got this little church in Newton, but I know I'm about to retire, and this may be a good time for us to make this change. Let's do the RCIA thing. So she starts calling up different priests, and she gets the wrong one. It's not the one she thought she was going to get, and we ended up with Father Edmund Klein, who was a brother at one time down at the studios in Alabama, and he knew you, and he agreed to take us through RCIA privately because we didn't want to disrupt everything going on with the churches that we were still involved with. So every Wednesday night we went to Resurrection Church in Wichita, Kansas, kind of snuck in there and went down to the basement, did RCIA, and Father Edmund kept looking at us going, wow, your journey. He said, you need to think about going on the Journey Home program. And I said, you're kidding me. I mean, that was like, come on. Yeah. But he said, I know those guys. I said, really? So anyway, he took us through RCIA. We then basically shut down that little church because, what I told him was I was retiring, which I was, from Blue Cross and Blue Shield. But at the same time, as the weeks dwindled down, we began to say, you guys have known for a long time how much I defended the Catholics before I was Catholic. Well, we're going into the church. And I'll never forget having to walk into Quentin and Annie's office with my resignation letter. That was the toughest day. Yeah. You know, maybe second only to when Connie passed. And it was tough. But, you know, when you know, Marcus, you got to do it. And so we made that move. And we joined the RCA class at St. Teresa's in Hutchinson, Kansas. Father Nick Volker was the priest at that time. They let us come in at the very last minute. And came in at the Easter Vigil. Oh. And I came in with a Texan. He'd moved to Kansas, but he was a Texan, and we came in, he was a convert too, and we cried and laughed and had the best time. But what had happened that was so strange, one of the communion services we had back at the old church, we had this incredible service where we had Holy Communion, we were passing trays. Well, there was a young guy, he was probably 16, 17, and he was part of that service. I didn't know who he was, but he'd been watching me. And he came up during that service, and he had something in his hand. He said, are you a pastor here? I said, yes, sir, I am. Can I help you? He said, well, I found this on the floor, and it was a wafer that had fallen to the floor, and he's holding it in a way that I'm thinking, I'm looking in this kid's eyes, and he's got some understanding that I don't have at that point. He was holding that in such a way that that was Jesus to him. And that impacted me. Now, that happened several years before he became Catholic, but I never forgot it. Here we are at the Easter Vigil. And I look up, and guess who's assisting the priest that night? Up at the altar, that same kid. And I thought, Lord Jesus, what you have done for us. We came into the Catholic Church, and wow. 3 months later, I get this wonderful person shares with me about a master's program at Newman University in Wichita, Kansas, where you can Masters of Theological Studies, and the diocese will pay for it. And I thought, I'm enough Catholic to be dangerous at this point. I better do this. So we took the next 2 years, and it was mostly online, but then we had some on-campus stuff. Beautiful. Last 3 credit hours are in Rome. Now we had to pay for that part. But Father Joe Guile was the head of graduate studies, and he took us on the tour to Rome. Oh, my heavens. Every cathedral you walked in, you thought, can't be better than the last. And yet it was. And I remember we went to Assisi. And outside of Assisi, after we toured the whole city for a beautiful day, we were in the cappuccino shop. And someone asked Jackie and I, well, share your journey into the church. We were in a cohort of 25 people. And within 10 minutes, we're kind of all in tears. And this lady says, you need to go on that Journey Home program. And I thought to myself, this is crazy, because we've heard it now 3 or 4 or 5 times. Well, then after I got my master's, then I decided that the best thing I could do with what I had just learned for the last 2 years is start permanent adult formation classes in both St. Teresa's, and also there was a little Catholic church in Little River, Kansas, the Holy Trinity, and we began classes in both of those churches, and they were to be permanent classes that would outlive Jackie and I. We were passionate about making sure that adult formation was something that had to happen all the time. And then those began to have some growth to them. Got involved with the Cursillo movement, of all things. I didn't go to any meeting that had a Spanish name. I wasn't sure what I was doing, so. But I had an incredible weekend. Yeah. And then that grew, and so hello to my Cursillo brothers and sisters. But Father Mike Maybrier then followed Father Nick. This was about 2 years ago, and we thought, well, we better sit down with Father Mike and tell him what we're doing, and kind of tell our journey a little bit. So we sat down and we had an hour appointment with him, and after a while I had to lean over and get his jaw back up, because he was so shocked by it. And at the end of that he said, you need to go on that. And I thought, well, Jesus,
here you are.
If that's it, then that's it.
The church was way over here and you were starting way over here, but being drawn by the Holy Spirit, not just together, but I mean being drawn to become more and more and more Catholic. Mm-hmm. Why didn't you just make your church Catholic? Why did you come in? What in the end?
That's a very easy answer. It was clear to me that the leadership of our church was not going to go that direction. And you know what? They hadn't had the experiences we had had. Malcolm Smith was a big part of how we really, the Eucharist is what drew us. I mean, that's what drew us. And that was not the understanding of some of our leadership. It just wasn't. Now, they loved Holy Communion and they loved the Eucharist, but we saw it in a very different light than a number of folks did. And so we knew, we got to do this. And when you know, then you've got to do it.
Yeah, and it's not enough to just have the robes and do all the right actions and maybe even just say the words. We're talking about the church our Lord started.
Yeah.
The apostolic succession, the ordination of a priest that changes him to be able
Yeah.
Yes.
to not just say this is the body and blood,
Yeah.
but by the grace of God to make it the body and
Yeah.
blood of our Lord, and to forgive sins.
Yeah.
I mean, penance was a new thing for the two of you, right?
Yes, our first confession was very interesting.
That is what actually, one of the things that as I was going through all these changes in my spirit, I was thinking, I think I probably need to have some way to do confession, because I was learning about confession and knew we didn't have it in our church. We could confess to one another, but that wasn't the same thing as being absolved. It just wasn't. And
Well, and I am thankful for how we got to where we got, because quite frankly,
Oh my
if it
gosh.
hadn't been for the fact that we then had that meal every week for a while, and then Mike Warnke comes, I mean, and Wayne Busada comes back into our lives. I mean, I am so thankful. Quentin and Annie are still very good friends, and quite frankly, he just had tea with the Pope last week as part of a charismatic thing that's going on between the convergent churches and the charismatic Episcopal communions that are going on. That's all wonderful, and I am so thankful. And I think we're both in a good place. I really do. But this is where we were supposed to be.
Yeah, the Lord knows how to lead us all, because he knows us better than we know ourselves, right?
He does. And you better be following after the truth. If you are seeking the truth, you better accept that that's your walk and your journey, no matter what it takes you to.
And on my adult formation classes, I've started to call them OFC University, for On Fire Catholics University. And I'm actually putting together a website. And so we're excited about the energy that's going on there, because working with the Catholics that we've had in these classes have been amazing. It really has. And I love cradle Catholics. I love cradle Catholics. As that flame begins to be a fire, it's just amazing to watch. So,
Got an email here. Let's see if we can squeeze this one in here. David from Fort Collins writes, in Tim and Jackie's opinion, what is the best scriptural basis that the Eucharist is truly Jesus and not merely a symbol? When I talk to Protestant friends, they all tell me that Jesus meant for communion to be only symbolic, and that it's not anything more than that.
I can answer that one.
Go right ahead.
The road to Emmaus, the two on the road to Emmaus. Wow. When I think about this, you know, they begged Jesus to come in. He blessed it, he broke it, he gave it, and all those years I thought, and he disappeared. Isn't that cute? But he didn't disappear. He was in their hands. And when I got that, that's when I knew we were going to be Catholic.
Yeah.
And
And then-
that's much more than a symbol. And then John 6 that I had read so many times, heaven's sakes. And it just, when I finally read it with my, as Michael Cumbie would say, put your Catholic glasses on, they're the original pair. When I read it that way, then everything changed for us.
Yeah, I remember once, you know, that with the ascension of our Lord and the way it's described in Scripture, they're kind of sitting there looking, you know, why are you looking up there? You know, I mean, you know, by our Lord, in a way, going there allows us to turn our attention back to what our mission is all about.
Yeah.
And in that upper room, when he disappears, our attention
Yes.
is where it needs to be.
Yes.
And the beauty of that whole story is also you have the Word, right? The beginning
Yes.
part where he's describing
Yes.
all the Old Testament relationship to him, and the breaking of bread. You have the
Yes.
Mass
Yes.
in the Emmaus Road.
Yes.
It's all there.
And we enjoy the miracle of the Mass every time we go now. It's just been amazing.
Do your whole family come in with you?
Our youngest daughter, Chrissy, who's had 5 kids in 6.5 years, so her life is full, she actually came in kind of on her own, because we really were just trying to figure out what we were doing, and yet she watched us very, very carefully. And I'll never forget the day she called up and said, "Pops, I'm coming in." And that blessed us. Our oldest kids, Luke and Laura, are already Catholic. And the 2 middle ones love Jesus with all their hearts. They really do, and have beautiful families, and we're thankful for them. And some of the emails I got before I got to this show today, they're worth the trip because they just were beautiful, beautiful send-offs for us to be on the show. So
You might tell them about Randy and Shannon.
Randy and Shannon were a very critical couple in that little church over in Newton. And we just got an email this past Easter that they were coming into the church. So they also came in, and we're excited about that as well.
Well, Jackie and Tim, thank you.
Thank
Good to see you again, but also to have you
Thank you,
finally
Marcus.
on the journey home.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing your journey
You
with
bet.
us.
Thank you,
Thank you very
Marcus.
much. And thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. I do pray that Tim and Jackie's journey is an encouragement to you. God bless you. See you next week.